Welcome to the latest episode of I Was 8. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is my personal journal podcast about growing up in a small Canadian prairie town. Next week, no school lunches for this kid. But now, let us pray. It's season 2 of I Was 8.
Chapter 11. Confession.
Nothing put a damper on an 8-year-old's Saturday afternoon like having to go to confession. For those of you who weren't raised Catholic, let me explain the basics. The Catholic faith, like most, suggests you lead a decent life. There's a very long and complicated list of rules on how exactly to do this. For the most part, they don't really expect you to be able to follow all of those rules, unless you're pious, or your name is pious, or something. For the rest of us lowly Catholics, they've broken it down to a short list. 10 rules. Not suggestions, but commandments. Can you at least manage those? They already knew the answer. No, we can't. They also understood pretty quickly that if everyone who broke the rules was kicked out of the club, membership would dwindle quickly. So they set up a system. If you break the rules, confess. Do penance. Get communion. And you're back in the good books. Until the next time. Oh, and there will be a next time. We are only human. You know, Sunday to Sunday, most people could manage no killing or no stealing. But you couldn't even covet. No coveting. It's clearly listed. Graven images, all right, usually not a big deal, but no lying? God damn it. I mean, gosh darn it. It's tough not to lie. You see, they got me again. Taskmasters. All right, so that was the goal. Live an entire week sin-free so that on Sunday you could have communion, which is representative of ingesting the body and the blood of Christ. Christ. Yes, Christ. When I was a kid in our church, this was actually done with bread and wine. Yeah, a bunch of croutons and some sweet red. When I got a little older, I was an altar boy, and I'll tell you, nothing beats the taste of a few spoonfuls of red wine on an empty stomach at 11 on a Sunday morning. I actually got a buzz going a couple of times. Eventually, all the churches just went to what they call a host, the wafers, made and blessed by the Catholic Church at the Vatican Wafer Factory. Vatican Wafers, the VW. Actually, Volkswagen sued them for copyright back in the 60s and won. None of that last part is true. I lied. I'm confessing. So at 8, you couldn't lie or sin in any way because by then you were old enough to know better. This was hard, not only because being 8 is fraught with sinful behavior, but then there was this matter of the devil. It was irrelevant how many times you prayed, "Lead us not into temptation and deliver us from evil." The devil's entire job was to lead you to temptation and deliver you to evil. The devil understood same-day delivery before anyone else. Sin this morning and we'll verify that you're evil by late afternoon. Absolutely, positively, 100% guaranteed, or you'll get your soul back. So why was confession so stressful? Well, I'll tell you. At age 8, I had bought in completely. God, the devil, heaven, hell, eternal suffering, the whole 9 yards, and the 10 commandments, and the 11 great principles, and the 12 apostles, and it goes on. So to recap, sin, confess, do penance, get communion. The 10 commandments, your basic guide. However, there was a huge sin not listed. If you take communion with a sin on your soul, that too was a major offense. Big sin. So I had to confess and do penance on a Saturday afternoon, because that's when it was held, and it was some 18 hours before communion was even available. I had to remain sin-free for 18 hours. 18 hours that included a Saturday night. I mean, the Leafs would lose on Hockey Night in Canada. That would at least involve a profanity. By this point, I'd probably lied about cleaning my room and finishing my homework. There's 2 more. Well, actually, 4, because my father and mother ordered me to do those things, and I disobeyed them. These are small potatoes. I guess maybe I could get a sentence commuted to purgatory. But taking the communion with those sins on your soul, that was straight to hell. So maybe you're saying, then just don't take communion the next day. Well, that's no good, because then the priest and your parents and all of the town knew that you had sinned sometime since yesterday afternoon during confession at 5 o'clock. That was like hell on earth. Which one was worse? At 8, it was quite vexing. Let me also explain confession. You can't just confess anywhere to anyone. I couldn't just go to my idiot friend Philip and say, "Hey, sorry, dude, had evil thoughts about your sister." Invalid confession. You had to confess to a registered representative of the Catholic Church. Let me explain the corporate structure. The Pope is the CEO. The cardinals are his VPs and board of directors, what have you. Imagine those office politics. Your archbishops are like area managers, bishops like district managers, and the priest, well, he runs the local shop. You confess to the priest in a dark booth at the back of the church. It's all quite anonymous, except for our town had like 1,000 people, 7 churches. Do the math, you figure maybe a couple hundred at best at our church. You mean to tell me he didn't know that was a little Larry in there, running through his list of misdeeds? Yeah, if he said so, he'd be lying. You had to memorize the format. You walked in, knelt down, sign of the cross, and say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was," you said the date, and then list the transgressions committed since that last confession. Not only the sins, but how many times you committed them. I lied 5 times. I took the Lord's name in vain 3 times, and so on. This too was a point of stress for me. See, I never really kept track during the week, so I had to do guesstimates. This was tough because if you said you lied 5 times, and it was really 7, then you didn't get penance or absolution for those other 2 lies. Ergo, you took communion with a sin on your soul. Again, H-E double hockey sticks. At the beginning, I used to lowball my guesses so that I didn't sound like Satan on earth to Father Harvenko. After all, he knew that it was me on the other side. When I realized how this would negatively affect my eternal afterlife, I started rounding up. If I thought I had lied about 7 times since my last confession, I rounded up to 10. Not a lie, really, just a fair appraisal. Appraisal. The word pray is right in there, isn't it? Well, and hey, if I said 10, but only had 7, it's like I had 3 free lies in the bank for next week. Bonus. I was like an accountant for the mob talking to the tax man. I was just making up numbers to get him off my back. After confession, you went to a pew, knelt down, and said your penance. The penance the priest gave you, as I said, mostly just prayers, usually no jail or community service. I was convinced the priest had a chart, early version of an algorithm, this sin equals this prayer, 3 sins, 3 prayers, so on. So you knelt down and recited your 3 Our Fathers and your 5 Hail Marys, and then back home for Bugs Bunny cartoons. Of course, I did not condone the violence in those television programs, otherwise I would be sinning. I watched them only for research purposes. The more sins, the greater the penance. I got a few Our Fathers and Hail Marys usually, but I couldn't help but notice Mrs. Needle was on her third rosary. What was she up to last week, I'd like to know? Sometimes in the middle of praying, I'd lose track of how many Hail Marys I'd done. If I wasn't sure, once again, I'd round up. Yeah, that felt like 5. I was also thinking of God there, because I thought you don't want to overpray. If you overpray, God could be like, enough already. You're not my only client. God was like an Uber version of your parents. Stop asking me for everything. Figure it out for yourself. That was it. As I said, back home under pressure not to sin until church the next morning. Didn't always make it. Committed the huge crime of taking Jesus with a sin still on my soul. Terrible times. How did I even make it to 9 years old without spontaneously combusting into a hellfire? Well, I'll tell you. Somewhere along the way, I heard about the deathbed confession, probably from TV. The deathbed confession. Hold on. What's involved here? Well, according to TV, you could be the worst murdering person on the planet, and just before death, either in a bed or in the electric chair, a priest would show up and take your confession. If you were really sorry, and I imagine at that point you really were, there still might be a place for you in heaven. The priest would say to God, look, he broke all the commandments hundreds of times, but he said sorry. Hey, I said I was sorry. All right, come in. This is heaven. Someone will be with you shortly. Wow, why was I so stressed about sinning between confession and communion, then committing the sin of taking communion with the sin on my soul? There'd be another confession next Saturday. I could just confess that. How bad could it be? A couple extra Our Fathers? Maybe an Apostles' Creed? I can do that. I had discovered the flaw in the system. If illegally trying to absolve your sins was a sin, you could just confess that as a sin. Then if you sinned again, you could just confess that sin. And if you kept piling them up over the course of a lifetime, there was the deathbed confession. Hey, I'm sorry. I got to tell you, that was a load off. After that, life got much easier. Oh, I still tried for the clean slate. Tried not to lie or disobey or swear. When it didn't work, I dutifully knelt down in the dark booth on a Saturday afternoon. I was at least partially holy. When I lined up for communion the next morning, even though I might have had an outstanding unpaid fine, I did notice those who weren't lining up for communion. Sinners, I remember thinking. I wonder what they did. Did they lie, kill, covet? Yeah, he looks like a coveter. Also, more often than not, I was in line right behind Mrs. Needle, bless her heart. Not sure about her soul, but bless her heart, she too made the effort. In our church after the communion was the sermon, sometimes a reading, often a homily, occasionally a parable. I always thought that we weren't needing a reading, and I preferred a psalm or a homily to a terrible parable. I remember that during the sermon, most of the men smoked cigarettes. My grandfather, like most men, smoked those little roll-your-owns right down to the roach. And at the end, they would lick their thumb and forefinger and put it out. They used the cuffs of their pants as an ashtray. And the scene that played out after church each Sunday was men on the sidewalk out front after Mass emptying their cuffs of ashes, a gray cloud of dust around all their ankles. The sermon was usually about how to live a holier life, sin-free, in other words. I did think it would be cool to accomplish that, live an entire week without sin, skip confession, the middleman, so to speak, and go right to communion on Sunday morning. Hey, Father, it's me, Larry. That's right, lining up for communion. Didn't see me at confession yesterday, did ya? You know why? I'm sin-free. That's right, sin-free. You're not the only holy one around here. That never happened. Never happened. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was when I was 8. Since then, I have lied 5,000 times. Make that 6,000. I have taken the Lord's name in vain 482,000 times. I coveted 18,813 times. I never killed anyone, but I felt like killing someone 672 times. I stole something 412 times, mostly grapes at the grocery store. I have not honored the Sabbath 3,000 times. I have done dozens of great things.
I Was 8 is a weekly series written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. A new episode every Thursday. Share your stories with Larry, or if you like, share Larry's stories with a friend. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Larry Fedoruk, that's Fedoruk, can be reached at larryfedoruk37@gmail.com.